I'm Lydia Vaughn, 45, and I have spent most of my life being the quietest person in every room I walked into. For 18 years, I served in places I still cannot name, under a call sign that started as a joke, while the people closest to me decided that quiet meant small. But when a colonel I had never met tried to make a punchline out of me in front of a room full of officers, I finally just answered his question. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to ask who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit that like button and subscribe. My father could fix anything with his hands and almost nothing with his words, and for the first 30 years of my life, I confused the two. Walter Vaughn was a machinist for 41 years, and his entire understanding of the world fit inside a single sentence he repeated like a prayer. Real work leaves a mark on your hands. He would hold up his own palms, scarred and stained, and you were supposed to understand that this was the only proof of a life that counted. I grew up believing him. I think that is the part that took me the longest to forgive. Not that he doubted me, but that for so many years, I doubted myself right alongside him. We lived in a small house 2 states away from where I sit now, in a town where everybody knew what everybody's father did for a living. Walter's answer was clean and simple. He ran a lathe, he could explain it to the neighbors, and the neighbors nodded, and that nodding was the currency he trusted. My mother was quieter, and she has been gone 11 years now, but she kept a different kind of ledger. She saved things. Report cards, a ribbon from a track meet, a newspaper clipping the size of a stamp. She never argued with my father about what mattered. She just refused to throw away the evidence that something did. I was a watchful child. I learned early that explaining myself to my father only gave him more to argue with. So I stopped. When I told him at 17 that I wanted to join the army, he set down his coffee and looked at me the way he looked at a part that had come back from a supplier out of spec. Not angry, just disappointed in a way he considered reasonable. He said the army was a costume, that I would wear it for a few years and then come home and get a real job, something he could picture. I did not argue. I had already learned that the only answer that ever changed his mind was time, and I was willing to spend years of it. In the spring of 2002, I commissioned as a second lieutenant. I was 21, the ceremony was small, held outdoors on a bright, cold morning, and my father came in a jacket that was too tight across the shoulders because he had bought it for a wedding 9 years earlier. I remember scanning the crowd for him while the colonel spoke, and I remember finding him with his arms crossed, polite, patient, waiting for it to be over. Afterward, he shook my hand. He did not hug me. He told a cousin standing nearby that I would get it out of my system, that I would be home in 4 years with a haircut to grow out. He did not say it cruelly. That was the thing about my father. He never raised his voice. He just decided what was true and waited for the rest of us to catch up. I caught a ride back to post that afternoon instead of going to the lunch they had planned, and I told myself it was because of the duty schedule. It was not. It was because I could not sit at a table and watch my father be kind to me in the specific way he was kind to people he had already counted out. I was an officer now. I had taken an oath that meant something to me even if it meant nothing he could name. And I made a decision in the back of that car that shaped the next 2 decades of my life. I decided I would stop trying to be understood by the one man who refused to ask, and I would go find people who would. What I did not understand yet was how completely I would disappear. The career I was walking into was not the kind you could describe at a holiday table. It was not the kind you could photograph or frame or explain to the neighbors. For a man who measured worth by what he could see and name, I was about to become invisible in exactly the way he most distrusted. I knew it would cost me something at home. I told myself the work would be worth the cost. For a long time, I was the only one who believed that. I learned to be enough of an audience for myself. There is a particular kind of childhood you have when your father has already decided who you are. You stop bringing him things. By the time I was 12, I had quietly stopped showing him the report cards and the certificates and the small evidence my mother still gathered, because I had learned that handing them to him only invited the gentle correcting frown, the reminder that grades were not the same as character, and character was not the same as a trade you could name. I do not tell you this for sympathy. I tell you because it is the root of everything that came after. The reason I became a person who could disappear into a career nobody could see and not feel the absence of applause. My father trained me, without ever meaning to need no audience at all. It was the hardest gift he ever gave me, and it was also, I have come to believe, the one that kept me alive. A person who does not need to be seen can go to the places I went and do the things I did and come back without breaking, because she is not waiting for anyone to tell her it mattered. She already knows. Or she has trained herself to act as though she does, which for a very long time amounts to the same thing. I would spend most of my adult life believing those two things were identical, and only much later would I learn the small and crucial difference between them. And I learned, slowly, that the quietest person in the room is very often the one who has the least left to prove, and simply chooses not to. The distance between my father and me did not arrive all at once. It widened the way a crack widens, a little at a time, every time I came home with less I could say. By 2006, I was a captain, and I had volunteered for an assessment and selection process I was not allowed to describe. When it was over, I belonged to a part of the army that does not appear in the photographs families pass around. I could tell my father that I had been promoted. I could not tell him what I did. To him, the vagueness was not discretion. It was failure I was too proud to admit. I remember a phone call from that time. I had called home on a rare free evening, and I told him I was doing fine and could not say much more. There was a long pause on the line, the kind my father used like a tool. Then I heard him turn his head away from the phone and say to a cousin in the room with him that I was still playing soldier. Still playing. As if 8 years in, I were a child in a cardboard helmet. I did not correct him. I had stopped correcting him years before. But I sat with the phone against my ear for a while, after we hung up, listening to the dial tone, and I let myself feel it just long enough to remember it. The call sign came in 2008, and it came as a joke, the way the good ones always do. We were in a team room before a rotation, and one of the senior guys decided to do a mock inspection of everyone's kit. The kind of thing that is half discipline and half theater. When he got to mine, he dumped it out on the table for laughs, and out tumbled a crushed bag of gummy candy I always carried. I had carried it since my first deployment because in the worst hours, when nothing else worked, something sweet and stupid in your mouth could keep your hands steady. The whole room lost it. The senior guy held up the bag like he had found contraband and said, "That's it, your gummy one. Nobody will ever be scared of it." He was right, and that was the point. I let them have the joke because the joke was useful. A woman they underestimated was a woman who could move through a room without anyone bothering to track her. A call sign nobody feared was a call sign that made people careless around me. I learned to wear the name the way I had learned to wear my father's doubt, as a kind of cover. At home, it was one more piece of evidence that I was not serious. Downrange, it was about to become the last thing 9 men heard before they let themselves believe they were going to live. I did not know that yet. In 2008, it was just a laugh in a team room and a name written in marker on a whiteboard. It was around this time that I leaned hardest on the one friendship that has carried me my whole career. Pat Sterling and I met as lieutenants, and Pat was everything I was not in those years. Loud where I was quiet, quick to take up space where I had trained myself to take up none. Pat could not know the details of what I did either, but Pat understood the shape of it, the way you can understand the shape of a thing under a sheet without lifting the sheet. One night, after I had told her about my father for the 100th time, she said something I carried for years. She said, "They'll find out who you are eventually, and you won't even have to be in the room." I laughed it off. I told her that my father would go to his grave, thinking I had wasted my life. Pat just shook her head and said, "I'm not talking about your father. I'm talking about you." I did not know what she meant then. I thought being seen required convincing someone. I thought respect was the thing you argued for, the way my father argued for the value of his scarred hands. It took me another 16 years, and a colonel I had never met to understand that there is another way the truth comes out. It does not come out because you raise your voice. It comes out because at some point you stop lowering it, and the people who already know the truth do the rest. But in those years, I was still managing it all. Still translating myself into a language my father might approve of, still letting a goofy call sign do its quiet work. I should tell you what those years actually felt like, because the cost of them is easy to summarize and hard to truly convey. I missed things. I missed weddings and funerals and the ordinary Sundays that knit a family together, and I could never fully explain why. So to the people I loved, my absence looked like indifference. There is no medal for the holidays you spend in a place you cannot describe, and there is no way to bank the goodwill you lose by being gone. My father kept a tally of those absences, I think, the way he kept a tally of everything, and each missed gathering became another entry in the ledger of evidence that I had chosen some abstraction over my own blood. I understood how it looked. That was the worst part. From the outside, a person who vanishes for months and comes home unable to say where she was and unwilling to defend herself looks exactly like a person with something to hide or nothing to show. I could not win the argument because I was not allowed to make it. So I stopped trying and I let the silence be read, however the reader chose to read it, and I told myself, over and over, that the work was its own justification, even if no one I loved would ever know its shape. I had no idea how loud that name was about to become. The morning of the briefing, I got there early, the way I always do, and I took a seat at the far end of the long table where I could see the whole room without the room having to see me. It was an interagency joint session, the kind that pulls together people who do not usually sit in the same building, mixed branches, a few civilians, a handful of men I recognized as operators by the way they held themselves rather than by anything they wore. I had a notebook and a pen, and I intended to use both and say very little. I have learned that the people who talk the most in a room like that are almost never the people who decide anything in it. Colonel Grant Whitfield was the loudest man at the table before the meeting even started. I did not know his name yet, but I knew the type within 30 seconds. He had the kind of uniform that has never been rained on, and the kind of confidence that comes from briefing things rather than doing them. He was telling a story about a command he had held, dropping the names of bases the way some men drop the names of restaurants, and the staff officers around him laughed at the right moments because that is what staff officers around a colonel do. I wrote a few notes. I was not paying him much attention. That, I think, is what bothered him. Because at some point a man like that takes a sweep of the room and counts who is looking at him, and he found one person who was not. A quiet woman at the end of the table, writing in a notebook, not laughing at his stories. I have spent my whole life being that woman, and I have watched men decide over and over that a woman who is not impressed by them must be a woman who does not understand them. He set his coffee down. He smiled, the kind of smile that is really an instruction. And he pointed his pen at me down the length of the table. "And you are," he said. The room turned. "What's your call sign, sweetheart? Cookie? Cupcake?" The staff officers laughed. It was not loud, but it was real. The easy laugh of people who assume they are on the winning side of a joke. I felt the old familiar thing rise in me, the instinct to make myself smaller, to wave it off, to let him have it so the meeting could move on. I had done that 1,000 times. I had done it for my father at 1,000 dinners. For 18 years, I had let men exactly like this one fill in the blank next to my name however they wanted, because correcting them had never once felt worth the cost. But I was 45 years old, and I was tired in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. I was tired of translating myself. I was tired of being the punchline in rooms full of people who would never carry what I had carried. So I did not make myself smaller. I set down my pen, and I looked at him, and I answered his question in a voice that was not loud at all. "Gummy one," I said. The laughter stopped. It did not fade. It stopped, all at once. The way a sound stops when a door closes. For a moment, Whitfield's smile stayed exactly where it was, because his face had not yet received the news his ears had. And then, at the head of the table, Lieutenant General Howard Beckett rose to his feet. 3 stars. He did not do it quickly or dramatically. He just stood, the way you stand when something requires it. Halfway down the table, a sergeant major I had not even noticed stood with him, and I knew that face. I would have known that face anywhere. His jaw was tight and his eyes were already wet, and he was looking at me like a man looking at something he had stopped letting himself believe he would see again. Whitfield looked around, and for the first time all morning he was not in command of the room. "Wait," he said. The confidence had a crack in it now. "Who is that?" General Beckett did not even look at him when he answered. He kept his eyes on me, and he said it plainly for the whole room to hear. "That's the officer who brought 9 men home when command wrote them off." And then they stood. Not all at once, but in a wave that moved down the table as recognition reached each of them. the operators first and then everyone else, chair after chair pushing back, until the only person still sitting in that room was the colonel who had asked for my call sign as a joke. I did not say anything else. I did not need to. I have thought a great deal in the time since about why that moment landed the way it did, and I have come to believe it had almost nothing to do with me. I did not silence that room. The room silenced itself the instant it understood what it was looking at, and all I had done was give it the one piece of information it had been missing. That is the thing people misunderstand about a moment like that. They imagine it as a victory, a blow struck, a comeback delivered. It was not. I delivered nothing. I answered a question, 2 words long, in an even voice. And then I watched a room full of people who already knew the truth do the only thing the truth left them to do. The power was never in my saying it. The power was in the fact that, for once, I had not arranged my face into the apologetic softness men like Whitfield expect, had not laughed along to make the moment smaller, had not done any of the 1,000 small things I had spent a lifetime doing to make other people comfortable with underestimating me. I had simply told the truth and let it weigh what it weighed. And it turned out the truth, set down plainly on a table, weighs a great deal more than I had ever let myself believe. I had spent 18 years learning that the truth does not require my volume. It only required that one time I stopped lowering it. The meeting had to continue. That is the strange thing about moments like that one. The world does not stop to let you feel them. General Beckett sat back down after a moment and the agenda resumed, and I delivered the portion I had come to deliver. A technical assessment that was the actual reason I was in the building. My voice did not shake. If anything, it was steadier than usual. Because the thing I usually spend energy managing, the question of whether the room takes me seriously, had been answered for me. When I made a recommendation, the general deferred to it without hesitation. Whitfield said nothing for the rest of the session. He sat very still, the way a man sits when he is trying to become smaller, which is a thing I happen to know a great deal about. When it was over, I gathered my notebook and stepped into the hallway, and the sergeant major was waiting for me. Cole Ridgway. The last time I had seen his face up close, it had been gray with shock and loss of blood, and I had been close enough to count his eyelashes because I had been carrying him. He was a grown man now, broad and gray at the temples, the senior enlisted advisor to a command, and for a second neither of us said anything at all. Then he did not make a speech, because the best men never do. "You carried me 1.5 miles, ma'am," he said. His voice was rough. I counted every step later, when I could count again. I never stopped counting. I told him I knew. I told him I had counted them too, at the time, because counting was the only way to keep my legs moving. We stood there in a government hallway, 2 people who had been to a place almost nobody else would ever go, and we did not need to fill the silence. After a while he straightened, and the formality came back into him, and he said it had been the honor of his life to stand up in that room. Then he walked away, and I let him because some gratitude is too large to hold for very long without one of you breaking. That night I called Pat. I told her the whole thing, the colonel, the call sign, the room standing, and when I finished there was a silence on the line. Then she said, "How does it feel?" And I told her the truth, which surprised me as I said it. It did not feel like winning. I had imagined a moment like that for years, in the small, bitter way you imagine being vindicated. And the reality of it was nothing like the fantasy. There was no triumph in it. There was just a tired kind of quiet, like the quiet after you finally set down something heavy you had been carrying so long you forgot it was heavy. Pat understood, the way she always does. "It's not supposed to feel like winning," she said. "You didn't get even with anybody. You just got seen. That's a different thing, and it's a lonelier thing, and nobody warns you about the difference." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. She was right. For 18 years, I had told myself I did not need anyone to see me, that the work was enough on its own. And maybe it had been. But there is a part of a person that does not believe the work is real until somebody else's eyes confirm it. And that part of me had been starving for a very long time without my permission. I thought about my father. I thought about how he had spent 24 years deciding I was a disappointment he was too polite to name, and how he would never know about that room, and how even if he had been in it, he would not have understood what he was looking at. The men standing up would have been to him just men in a meeting. And the strange thing was that the room standing up had not closed the wound with my father at all. it had opened it. Because for the first time in years, I let myself want the one thing I had trained myself to stop wanting, which was for him to see me too. There was one more thing that night. As I was leaving the building, I had passed the parking structure, and Whitfield was there, standing by his car, not getting into it. He had the look of a man who had just discovered that the floor of his life was a story he had been telling himself. He saw me. For a second, I had every opportunity in the world to twist the knife, to say one quiet, devastating thing, and walk away and let him carry it. I had earned that by any ordinary accounting. I looked at him. He looked at me. And I gave him a small nod, the kind you give a man you are not finished with, but have decided not to destroy. And I kept walking. I want to be honest about why I gave him that nod instead of the thing he deserved, because it was not pure generosity, and I distrust people who pretend their mercy is effortless. Part of it was that I recognized him, not the man, the type, but the position, the specific posture of someone who has just learned that the ground they were standing on was never real. I had stood exactly there, in my own way, at various points in my life. Every time I had let my father's verdict become my own. I knew what it was to have your whole sense of yourself rearrange in an instant, and I knew that what a person does in the hour after that happens decides a great deal about who they become. If I said the cruel thing, I would freeze him in the worst version of himself, the version that had earned it, and he would stay there forever and call it my fault. If I said nothing, I left the door open for him to walk through and become someone else. I did not know whether he would. Most people do not. But I had spent a career learning that you do not get to choose what other people do with the chances you give them. You only get to choose whether to give them. So I gave him the nod, and I went home, and I left the rest up to a man I had no reason to trust, and I told myself that whatever he did with it was now his burden to carry and no longer mine. I did not know it yet, but that nod decided more than anything I had said all day. Word travels in a community as small as ours, and by the next morning the story of the briefing had outrun me. By the time I reached my office, there were 3 messages from people who had heard some version of it, most of them wrong in the details and right in the spirit, and there was a request to see General Beckett, which I expected, because a general who stands up in a room like that does not let the matter simply drop. His office was plain in the way that the offices of serious men usually are. He told me to sit, and then he came straight to the point, which I appreciated. He said that what Whitfield had done was not just rude, it was a failure of the basic discipline of his rank, and that if I wanted it, he could end the colonel's career with a phone call before lunch. He said it the way you offer a tool to someone you respect. Most people, he said, would let me do exactly that. I thought about it. I want to be honest because I think the honesty matters more than the nobility. I thought about it for a real moment. There's a version of me, a younger and angrier version, who would have taken the offer and felt it was justice. But I have learned something about what it costs to win that way. A man like Whitfield, ended, becomes a martyr to himself. He spends the rest of his life telling a story in which I am the villain who destroyed him over a misunderstanding, and he never once has to look at the actual thing he did. Ending him would have let him off the hook of becoming better. So I told the general no. I don't need him ended, I said. I need him useful. Beckett looked at me for a long moment, and then something in his face shifted, and he almost smiled. He asked me what I meant. I told him I wanted Whitfield sent forward, to actually see the work he had spent his career briefing from a distance, to stand in the gap between a slide deck and a door and understand what lives in it. Beckett said that was a harder punishment than ending him, and a better one, and that he would arrange it. Then I did the second hard thing of that week, which had nothing to do with Whitfield at all. I called my father, not to tell him about the room. He would not have understood it, and I had finally stopped needing him to. I called him because I had realized, sitting in Beckett's office, that I had been managing his opinion of me for 24 years the way you manage a chronic injury, working around it, never quite healing it. And I was done. He answered the way he always does, gruff, already half distracted. We talked about nothing for a few minutes, his shop, the weather, a part he was waiting on. And then I said the thing I had never said. I told him that I was not going to translate my life into words he would approve of anymore. I told him that I had spent my whole career trying to make him understand a job that I was not allowed to describe and that he was not willing to imagine. and that I was finished trying. I was not angry when I said it. That was the part that surprised me. I just said it the way you finally tell the truth about something. Plainly. There was a long silence on the line, the old familiar silence he used as a tool. But this time I did not rush to fill it. I had spent my whole life filling my father's silences, and I let this one sit. He pushed back a little. He said he had never asked me to explain anything. And that was so exactly the wrong thing to say, so perfectly the heart of the whole problem that I almost laughed. "That's right," I said. "You never once asked." And then I told him I loved him, and I meant it, and I hung up the phone first, which I had never done in my life. I sat at my desk for a while after that. A peer of mine stopped by, someone who had heard about the briefing, and he said something that I think he meant as a compliment. He said I should have buried Whitfield, that letting him walk made me look soft, that the optics of mercy were bad in a community that respects hardness. I told him the optics did not interest me. I told him that I had spent 18 years being underestimated and that I had learned exactly what it cost a person, and that I was not going to spend my one chance at the other side of it, doing to someone else what had been done to me. There is a belief in my line of work, and in a lot of lines of work, that mercy is a luxury the serious cannot afford. That hardness is the same thing as strength, and that anyone who declines to destroy an enemy they could have destroyed has simply lost their nerve. I understood the belief. I had been shaped by it. But I had also seen where it leads, in myself and in others, and I had come to think it was mostly a story that frightened people tell themselves to feel less frightened. The hardest thing I did that week was not refusing to bury Whitfield. The hardest thing was telling my father the truth and then letting his silence sit. Because that silence had been the central fact of my entire life, and filling it had been my oldest habit. Choosing not to twist the knife into a kernel cost me nothing I valued. Choosing to stop performing for my father cost me the only identity I had ever really had, which was the identity of the daughter still trying. I did not know who I was if I was not trying to be understood by him. I was about to find out. And the peer in my doorway, talking about optics and softness, had no idea that the conversation he thought he was having about a colonel was actually a conversation about a girl at a commissioning ceremony 24 years earlier, watching her father clap politely and mean none of it. He did not understand. That was all right. I had stopped needing to be understood. To understand why that room stood up, you have to understand what happened in the autumn of 2012. Because that is the day the joke stopped being a joke. I was a major then, 31 years old, and I was leading an element on a rotation I still cannot describe in any detail that matters. What I can tell you is the shape of it. A small team of our people had gone into a bad place to do a necessary thing, and the necessary thing had gone wrong, and they had ended up pinned down with no good way out and the weather closing in around them. I can tell you about the radio, because the radio is the part I will hear for the rest of my life. I can tell you that there came a point that night when a command element, weighing the risk against the cost, made a decision. They wrote those men off. I have read enough about that night, in the years since in the documents I am allowed to read, to know that somewhere a draft of an after-action report already existed in which those 9 men were a loss, a number. The order came down to stand down, to not go back in, to accept it. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this as a story about a brave woman defying her cowardly superiors, and that is not what it was. The people who made that call were not cowards. They were doing the brutal arithmetic that their job sometimes requires, trading a probable loss of 9 for a possible loss of 19. I understood the math. I just did not accept that the math was finished. I had information they did not have. About the ground, about the weather, about what my element could do, and I made a different calculation. And then I keyed my radio, and I told them what I was going to do. And the name that went out over that frequency, the name the controllers heard, the name that got logged was GUMMY 1. Nobody on that frequency was laughing at the name anymore. We went back in. I am not going to dramatize the next several hours because the men who lived them deserve better than to have their worst night turned into entertainment. It is enough to say that we reached them. It is enough to say that the withdrawal was long and it was ugly, and it asked everything of everyone, and that at one point the ground would not allow for anything but carrying, and so I carried. a wounded sergeant named Cole Ridgway, 27 years old, who had stopped being able to walk and had started, in the way men do when they think the end has come, to apologize. I told him to stop apologizing and save his breath. I told him I had him, and I counted my steps because counting was the only thing that kept my legs underneath me, and the number I reached was 1.5 miles. We brought all 9 home, not unharmed, but home, alive, to their families and their futures, and in Ridgway's case, to a career that would carry him all the way to sergeant major. The awards for that night were processed quietly, under seal, the way everything in my world is, which is why my father could spend the next 14 years believing his daughter had a vague desk job. The men who were there knew. The community knew. The story moved the way stories move in a closed world, by word of mouth, growing quieter and more permanent with each year, until a goofy call sign had become, among the people who knew, something close to sacred. That is why the room stood. They were not standing for a rank. They were standing for a frequency, and a night, and a name. And here is the part I did not expect. While I was remembering all of this, Whitfield was living a smaller version of it. He had gone forward, as I had asked. And word came back, eventually, in the form of a short note he sent me, written by hand, which I had not expected from him. It said only a few lines. He wrote that for his entire career he had briefed numbers, casualty estimates, and force ratios, and acceptable losses, and that he had been good at it, and that he had never once thought about the fact that the numbers had faces until he had stood close enough to the work to see them. I briefed 9 numbers for years, he wrote. I didn't know they had faces until last week. I have carried a lot of nights with me out of that part of my life, and most of them I keep in a place I do not open very often, because the mind can only hold so much weight at once and stay useful. But I let myself open that one here, for you, because I think it explains everything else. When I keyed the radio that night and said I was going back in, I was not being brave. I want to be very clear about that, because bravery is a word people use to make a decision sound simpler than it was. I was terrified. My hands were not steady, which is the entire reason I carried the candy in the first place. What I had, instead of fearlessness, was a refusal, a flat, animal refusal, to accept a version of events in which 9 men I could reach were left to become a paragraph in a report. It was not courage, it was stubbornness pointed in a useful direction. And maybe that is all courage ever is. In the end, stubbornness that happens to be aimed at something that matters. I have never been able to tell the difference, and I have stopped trying. What I know is that I went back, and that the men I went back for are alive. And that one of them grew up to stand in a briefing room 14 years later and rise to his feet before a 3-star general had finished his sentence. I read it twice, and then I put it in a drawer, and I understood that I had been right not to end him, because an ended man never writes a note like that. Forgiveness, the real kind, is not a moment. It is a slow accumulation of small earned things. And what happened over the following weeks was an accumulation. Whitfield came back from forward a quieter man, and he did the thing that actually matters, which is that he changed without announcing that he had changed. He started using his considerable talent for the unglamorous work of resourcing, fighting inside the building for the people he had finally seen, and he never once mentioned the briefing, never tried to apologize his way back into my good opinion. He just did better. That is the only apology I have ever fully trusted, the kind that takes the form of behavior. But the harder repair was the one happening 2 states away, and I was not even in the room for the start of it. My father told me about it later, in pieces, in the halting way he tells anything that costs him something. A younger man had come into his shop, a veteran, a relative of Cole Ridgway as it turned out, who had grown up hearing a story about the night his cousin came home. He saw the name Vaughn on an invoice, and he asked my father, just to be sure, whether he was any relation to a Lydia Vaughn. And my father, expecting nothing, said that he was her father. I have tried many times to imagine my father's face during the next few minutes, because the young man told him everything. Not the classified parts, which he did not know, but the parts that travel. He told my father that there was a woman in a certain community whose call sign was Gummy 1, and that men who had served 20 years went quiet when they said it, and that she had gone back in for 9 men on a night when she had been ordered not to, and had carried his cousin 1.5 miles over open ground, and that those men were alive and had children because of her. He told my father that he should know what his daughter was, in case nobody had ever told him. Nobody ever had. That was the thing. My father had built a story over 24 years out of the only materials I had given him, which was silence. And he had filled that silence with the worst interpretation because the worst interpretation was the one that fit the shape of the man he was. And now a stranger had walked into his shop and handed him a completely different story, and he had no idea what to do with it. He told me later that he had to sit down, that he closed the shop early that day for the first time in years and drove around for a while and did not know why he was crying because he did not have a word for what he was feeling. When we finally spoke about it, it was on the phone, and it was awkward because we did not have the muscles for a conversation like that one. He started 3 times and stopped. And then he asked me a question, and it was the first real question he had asked me in my entire adult life. "Why didn't you ever make me understand?" he said. "I could have been cruel. The cruelty was right there, easy to reach. I could have told him that it was not my job to drag understanding out of a man who had decided in advance not to grant it. But I have learned that you do not get the relationship you want by winning the argument about why you do not have it." So I told him the truth, gently. "You never once asked," I said. "For 24 years you decided what I was, and you waited for me to agree with you. You're asking now. That's the first time, and that's enough to start." He was quiet. And then my father, who had never in my hearing admitted to being wrong about anything, said that he supposed he had a lot of asking to catch up on. It was not an apology. He did not have the equipment for an apology, not yet. But it was a door, and after a lifetime of walls, a door is everything. Pat called me that night, because Pat always seems to know, and I told her what had happened. She did not say I told you so, though she had earned it. She just said, "The truth found you. You didn't even have to be in the room." I think often about how close that repair came to never happening, and how little of it I controlled. And if a young veteran had not happened to need a part machined, if he had not happened to read the name on the invoice, if he had not happened to be related to a man whose life intersected mine on a frequency in 2012, my father would have gone on believing his version of me until one of us died. The truth had been true the whole time. It had simply never had a path to him, because I had stopped building paths years before, out of exhaustion and self-protection and a pride I am not proud of. We tell ourselves that the truth will out, that it rises on its own like oil on water, but that is not quite right. The truth needs a carrier. It needs someone willing to walk into a machine shop and say a few sentences to a stubborn old man. For 24 years I had refused to be that carrier for my own story, had decided it was beneath me to argue for myself, and in doing so, I had also denied my father the only thing that could ever have changed him, which was information. A stranger gave him what I had withheld. I am not sure I will ever fully forgive myself for that, even though the ending was kind. There is a lesson in it I am still turning over about the difference between dignity and stubbornness, and how often I have mistaken the second for the first. And I remembered her saying that to me when we were lieutenants, half a lifetime ago, and I understood it at last. A few weeks later, there was a ceremony. It was small and it was sealed, the kind of recognition that happens in a closed room with no cameras, and a citation that will never be published, tied to that night in 2012 and processed at last after years in the slow machinery of a world that does its honoring quietly. I almost did not go. I have never been comfortable being the subject of a room's attention, which is one of the deeper ironies of my life. But Cole Ridgway was going to be there, and I would have crawled across broken ground to stand next to that man one more time. So I went. General Beckett presided. He read a citation that was short, the way the real ones are. No inflation, no theater, just the bare grammar of what happened. For actions above and beyond when she returned for those who could not return themselves. That was nearly the whole of it. I stood there and listened to a sentence describe the worst and best night of my life. And I thought about how a sentence is always too small for the thing it carries, and how that is all right, because the people in the room do not need the sentence. They were there. They know. Whitfield came. I had not invited him, and I had not expected him, and I found him standing at the back in his service uniform, having clearly worked to get himself into a room he had no formal reason to be in. He did not approach me. He did not make it about himself. When I entered, he simply stood, the way everyone stood, and there was nothing performative in it. He had become, in a handful of weeks, a man who understood what it meant to stand for someone, and he had chosen to spend that understanding on the woman he had tried to humiliate. I caught his eye once across the room and gave him the same small nod I had given him in the parking structure, and this time it meant something different. It meant we were all right. Standing in that sealed room, I let myself think about the call sign. Really think about it, for the first time in years. Gummy one. A joke from a team room in 2008, a crushed bag of candy, a name chosen precisely because nobody would ever be scared of it. And now it was the proudest thing I owned. It was the name 9 men had heard when they decided to keep living. It was the name a 3-star general had spoken into a silent room to put a colonel in his place without raising his voice. The joke had become the truest thing about me, and I would not have traded it for the most fearsome call sign in the inventory. There is a lesson in that I am still learning about how the things people give you to make you small can become, if you carry them long enough and well enough, the exact things that make you unmistakable. And I thought about my father, because of course I did. He was not in that room, he could not have been, and even if he could, the citation would have meant nothing to him, the ranks would have been just men in a meeting. For most of my life, that fact would have ached. But something had shifted. I no longer needed my father to be in the rooms where I'm known. I had the rooms. What I wanted from my father was something smaller and harder than recognition. I wanted to be his daughter, plainly, without a translation. And for the first time, I had reason to believe that might be possible. When I got home that night, there was an envelope waiting for me. I knew the handwriting before I had any idea what it would say. The cramped, careful block letters of a man who learned to write at a kitchen table 70 years ago and never trusted cursive. My father had not sent me a letter in my adult life. He is not a man of letters. He is a man of silences and tools and things you can hold. And there it was, on my counter, a white envelope with my name in his hand, and I stood looking at it for a long time without opening it, the way you stand at the edge of something. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel dread about what my father thought of me. I felt something I had almost forgotten how to feel, which was hope. I stood in my kitchen a long time with that envelope, and I will tell you what went through my mind because I think it is the most honest thing in this whole story. I was afraid. Not of bad news, exactly. I was afraid of hope, which is a far more dangerous thing to a person who has spent decades arranging her life so as not to need any. I had built an entire self around the assumption that my father would never see me, and that self had served me well, had made me capable, and self-contained, and able to walk into the worst rooms in the world without needing anyone's reassurance. If I opened that envelope and it contained what some part of me suspected it might, then that whole structure, that hard-won independence from his opinion, would have to be renovated. I would have to let him back in. And letting people in is the one thing my entire career trained me out of. It is easy to be brave about gunfire. It is much harder to be brave about a white envelope on a kitchen counter because gunfire only asks for your body. And the envelope was asking for the part of me I had spent 45 years keeping behind a wall. I almost set it down unopened. I want you to know that. The bravest thing I did in this entire story was not going back in 2012. It was reaching for that envelope. I knew his handwriting before I knew what it would say. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to find out. I opened it standing up in my kitchen, still in my uniform. My father is not a man who wastes words, and the letter was short, which somehow made it heavier. He wrote the way he talks, plain and a little rough, no flourishes, every sentence sounding like it had been measured twice before it was cut. He started by saying that he was not good at this, which I knew, and which was its own kind of tenderness, because a man who knows he is not good at something, and does it anyway, is a man telling you it matters. He wrote that a young fellow had come into the shop and told him some things. He did not repeat them, because he said he figured I knew them better than he did, and because some of them I probably was not allowed to hear him repeat, which made me smile because my father had finally understood the silence he had spent 24 years resenting. He wrote that he had looked nothing up, because there was nothing to look up, but that he had asked around plenty, quietly, in his own way, and that everywhere he asked, the answer came back the same. He wrote that he had spent my whole life thinking I had chosen a costume over a real life, and that he had been wrong, and that it had taken a stranger walking into his shop to make him see a thing that had been standing in front of him since I was 21 years old. And then he wrote the line I will keep until the day I die. He wrote, "I'm sorry it took a stranger to make me say it out loud. Your old man is proud." And he did not sign it, Dad. My father, who had spent my whole career refusing to say the name because the name was the joke, the proof that I was not serious, signed that letter, Gummy One's father. He had taken the very thing he had used to make me small, and he had claimed it and made it the thing that connected us. I sat down on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, and I read it 4 times, and I cried in a way I had not let myself cry in many years. I drove out to see him that weekend. The shop smelled the way it has always smelled, oil and hot metal and coffee gone cold in the pot. And my father was at his bench, and he did not know how to greet me, so he just held up a small thing he had made. He had taken a block of steel and machined it, carefully, the way he machines everything, into a small flat plaque. There was no inscription on it. He had not been able to bring himself to write words, because words have never been his tools. But across the face of it, milled clean and precise into the steel, were 2 words, Gummy One. That was all. That was everything. A man who could fix anything with his hands and almost nothing with his words had finally found a way to say the thing. In the only language he had ever fully trusted, the language of metal worked carefully by hand. I did not say much. He did not either. We did not need to. I have spent my life in a profession that taught me how much can pass between 2 people without a single word, and I stood in my father's shop and let a lifetime of it pass between us. The rest of it settled into something like peace. Cole Ridgway and I stay in touch, and his children know my name, which is a strange and enormous thing, to be a name in the house of a man you carried. Pat is Pat, still loud, still right more often than I would like to admit. Whitfield became, of all things, an ally, one of the most effective advocates in that building for the people who actually do the work, and we are not friends exactly, but we are something, 2 people who met at the worst version of one of us and chose to become better. My life feels open in a way it did not before, and the strange truth is that nothing about my job changed. What changed was that I stopped carrying the weight of being misunderstood. And you do not realize how heavy that weight is until the day you set it down. So let me say this to you directly, because if you have stayed with me this long, I think you might need to hear it. If you have spent your life being the quietest person in the room, the one people fill in the blank about without ever asking, hear me. You do not owe anyone the loud version of yourself. You do not have to argue for your own worth or translate your life into words that will make a doubter comfortable. Carry your work and carry it well and carry it long. The right people, the ones who are there, the ones who matter, already know your name, and one day, if you are very lucky, the people who gave you that name to make you small will be the ones who say it with pride. I keep the steel plaque on the shelf above my desk now, where I can see it when I look up from whatever I am working on. People who visit sometimes ask about it, this small unmarked block of metal with 2 odd words milled into its face. And I tell them it is a gift from my father, and I leave it there. They do not need the rest. The rest is mine, and it belongs to Frequency in 2012, and a team room in 2008, and a machine shop where an old man finally found the only language he could use to say he was sorry and he was proud. I have a chest somewhere with ribbons in it, the official kind, the kind that come with citations and ceremonies, and I value them. I do. But if my house were burning and I could carry out one object, it would be the plaque, because the ribbons were given to me by an institution that already understood what I was, and the plaque was given to me by the one person who never did, right up until the day he finally chose to. That is a rarer and harder thing. Recognition from the people whose job it is to recognize you is a kind of confirmation. Recognition from the person who spent your whole life refusing it is a kind of resurrection. I got both in the end, and I am aware every single day of how few people ever get either, let alone the 2 of them together. Mine did. I'm Gummy One. In these days, that is the truest and best thing anyone has ever called me. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. If you have ever been the quiet one, the one your own family decided they had figured out, I would really like to hear your story, so tell me about it in the comments. Was there a moment the truth about you finally surfaced, and who was in the room when it did? Did the people who underestimated you ever come around the way my father did, or are you still waiting? I read every comment, and I think there are more of us out here than any of us realize. If this story meant something to you, take a second to like it and subscribe and stay safe out there. You are not as invisible as they made you feel.